Thank you for the lovely introduction. And now I'd like to begin with an overview of a few facts about the First Folio. There were somewhere between 500 and 1,500 printed. Peter Blaney believes that there were 750 and Charlton Hinman believes there were 1,000, but no one knows for sure. Each book had a little over 900 pages. There are 36 plays in the book. Between 18 to 20 plays that pop up in this First Folio were unpublished. 3 plays were totally unknown. About 235 First Folios survived until today, but only 40 are considered complete. For more details, you can see Charlton Hinman's printing and proofreading of the First Folio. In 2016, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. took some of their very valuable folio collection on a tour, on a national tour. The accompanying materials in the exhibit did not even mention Ben Jonson's name. The Folger gave all of the credit for this book to the actors, John Heminges and Henry Condell. Sometimes the folio is called the Heminges and Condell edition. Trying to clear this up, I queried the Folger Library through the Ask a Librarian portal, and the librarian sent me this is what she said for my answer. The answer to your question is that there wasn't an editor in the way we think of such for the 1623 folio. The plays were brought together by Shakespeare's friends and theater colleagues, John Heminges and Henry Condell, and printed by Isaac Jaggard and Edward Blount. Actually, Blount was a publisher, but we're not going into that. But none of these people intervened in the text the way a modern editor would. They simply gathered and set the text as it was given. In this talk, I'm going to investigate the historical context of the First Folio to see if the Folger librarian's comment can stand up to scrutiny. Now, the reason for the Heminges and Condell attribution is based on 2 things that are in the prefatory material in the folio. One is the episcopal dedication, which, as you can see at the lower right, contains the name printed there, John Heminges and Henry Condell. And the other is the address to the great variety of readers, which down at the bottom, even smaller, are the names of the actors, John Heminges and Henry Condell. What supports the proposal that the 2 actors composed the addresses? What education or experience with writing, editing, or publishing might have equipped the actors for this job? What is the evidence? Nothing. As Charlton Ogburn explains these problems in his book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare, he says, "We do not know why the king's men would let 2 of the members appropriate so valuable a property and dispose of it on their own. We do not know how 2 actors would have raised a small fortune for such a publishing venture. We do not know why anyone putting up the funds would have left the immensely important task of editing the 36 plays to 2 undistinguished stage players with no experience to fit them for the work." Do we know, speaking of cost, do we know what this cost was? No, we don't have bank statements. But we do have a nice comparable publishing venture to look at. The Shakespeare First Folio was being worked on approximately a decade after the King James Version of the Bible. And so we're going to use the King James Version of the Bible because we know quite a bit about it as a comparable property. I'm going to follow Alistair McGrath, who is a professor at Oxford University. He's a professor of theology and history. And he wrote a very fine book on the King James, the story of the King James Bible in the beginning. And this is what he has to say about its cost. A substantial financial investment had to be made on the outset for the printer's type and other production costs. The printer did not have the £3,500. And this is his number. I don't know how he came up with it, but that is what he believes the production costs were. Which would be over $3 million in modern currency. But the printer did not have these funds set aside and turned to venture capitalists to fund the King James Bible. Since Alistair McGrath believes, and I think it's a certainty, that the King James Bible was privately funded, it wouldn't be a stretch to suggest that the First Folio of Shakespeare was also privately funded, which of course it is. Charlton Hinman says this exactly in his introduction to the Norton facsimile of the First Folio. The mere presence of Shakespeare's name on the title page of such an edition, as the publisher of one of them tells us, was enough to ensure rapid sale. But a folio edition of 36 plays was another matter entirely. It would call for a considerable outlay of capital, would take a long time to produce. The first folio was in press for almost 2 years and would hardly, when finished, be in great popular demand. It would be too expensive. Hinman goes on to say the folio was a decidedly chancy venture and one not likely to appeal to many publishers of the time unless some kind of guarantee against disastrous loss could be secured. We know nothing of any such guarantee, but it is inescapable that the brothers who bore the dedication were the only parties involved in the folio production who were in a financial position to bear the cost. So who are these guys? Here's our dedication. They are William Herbert, the third Earl of Pembroke, and his younger brother Philip Herbert, the first Earl of Montgomery. These two are our most noble and incomparable pair of brethren. William Herbert was the Lord Chamberlain of the king's household. This meant he was the gatekeeper for the king. Anyone who wanted to have an audience with the king, whether it was foreign diplomats, important people from other countries, his very important aristocracy, anyone who wanted to meet with the king had to go through William Herbert, the third Earl of Pembroke. This is the equivalent of today's White House chief of staff. His younger brother, Philip, was a gentleman of the king's bedchamber. As historians tell us, these men were the most influential people that were at court with the king and are known as the king's powerful inner cabinet. So what do we know about Ben Jonson in the First Folio? The information that I'm going to be giving you about Ben Jonson comes mostly from these three books, from these three biographies of Rosalind Miles, David Riggs, and Ian Donaldson. Now, we see Ben Jonson, and his presence is quite evident when you first open the book to the title page, and you see his initials across from the dressed-out engraving, where they are set very definitely to be exactly at the same level to be what your eye will see when you open the book. And the most memorable lines in the entirety of the introduction material is Ben Jonson's poem, which I want to point out to you is now on YouTube in a wonderful presentation by Alexander Waugh, and put that on your to-do list if you haven't viewed it already. Ben Jonson, I hold, is the editor of the First Folio, and even more served as what I tend to think of as an impresario of the First Folio. His credentials are that he was the leading playwright of the era. That is not in dispute. He was the leading literary figure of London, known as the dictator of the London literati. He was a court poet for the entire Stuart dynasty, first, of course, during this time, King James, and later for King Charles. And King James paid Jonson initially 100 marks annually, which was a very large salary. And it was raised rather quickly from 100 marks to 100 pounds, and then it was doubled to 200 pounds. So he was very well paid for his work for the king. So what did he do to earn this money? He wrote entertainments for the royal court. He wrote masques, poems, odes, verses, speeches, epigrams, and tributes, all kinds of things. These are some of the published entertainments that he wrote for the court. If you see at the top, I'm not going to go through this whole list. It's the Coronation Triumph he wrote in March of 1604 when it was performed. If you go down a ways, you'll see some speeches. Right across from here, the speeches of Prince Henry's barriers were in 1610. That whenever they had special occasions at court, they needed to have fancy speeches and talks, and sometimes the actors performed little interludes, and Ben Jonson wrote them. So you can see he was earning his money. This includes his masques, but it does not include this list, which is formidable, does not include his plays. He wrote plays for the King's Acting Company called the King's Men. And Heminges and Condell, we're finally getting back to them. They were actors in this company. The actors, of course, spoke the lines that Ben Jonson wrote, which meant that Ben Jonson was accustomed to putting words in the actors' mouths. In fact, there is a letter that someone saw at court, when someone saw an interlude at court, performed before the king's presence, and he wrote to a friend that the actors spake such language as Ben Jonson hath put into their mouths. So this is well known that the actors spoke what Ben Jonson wrote. These addresses that we had already looked at, the dedicatory epistle and the address to the readers, is largely what even further supports it. This was largely taken, wide swaths of it, from Jonson's own works. And I point out Catherine Children's fine book, Shakespeare Suppressed, where she sets out very clearly the works, the passages that come from Jonson's works and exactly the works that they're taken from. In addition, Jonson had experience having published his own writing in Folio. His works, published in 1616, is the earliest publication in England, the earliest of a collection of plays in a folio-sized book. And he has a special credential, too. Jonson was considerably more involved than most writers with the publishing process. His biographer, Ian Donaldson, writes that Jonson took a close and continuous interest throughout this period in the preparation of this volume, his 1616 works, calling to Stansby's printing house each morning to check the progress and supervise revisions. So what connects Ben Jonson with the incomparable brethren? The Herbert brothers lavished patronage on Ben Jonson, and in turn, Ben Jonson lavished praise on the Herberts and their cousins, the Sidneys. I won't go through all this exactly. Jonson dedicated a play to Pembroke in 1611. He dedicated another play this year to one of the Sidney daughters. He gave £20 each year. Pembroke gave £20 each year to Jonson. He said to buy books, but $20,000, it would equal about $20,000. That was a lot of money in and of itself. In 1619, Pembroke presented Jonson with a master's degree from Oxford University, which he could do because he was Chancellor of Oxford University. Additional connections. Jonson was often a guest at the Sidney's Manor home of Penshurst, the home of the Herberts' uncle and political ally, Robert Sidney, who would later be the Earl of Leicester. Pembroke and his Sidney relatives were the most praised people in Jonson's amazing collection of epigrams, written in 1612, published in his Folio 1616, and the epigrams were dedicated to Pembroke. By the early 1620s, I think it should be very clear that the King's Poet, which is what he was officially known as, had the right connections with all the right people and a proven track record of literary accomplishments. So it makes sense that this chancy venture, this financially chancy venture, would be put in Ben Jonson's capable hands. But doggone it, the Shakespeare experts at the Folger Shakespeare Library can't even bring themselves to mention Ben Jonson's name in any of their First Folio exhibitions. The First Folio project was a little bit risky for another reason, besides the possibility of financial loss. The task of preparing the plays for publication was likely to be even somewhat dangerous because political satire and sensitive personal information was freighted in the plays. These three men up there, certainly understood quite well that the plays were inundated with politically dangerous and somewhat seditious material. And this next slide is my own little joke. They didn't even have the benefit of Eva Turner Clarke's wonderful hidden allusions in Shakespeare's plays to help them out. So let's get back to our major line of demarcation, which is what this is. I believe that those of us in the authorship discussions believe that the printing of Shakespeare's 36 plays was likely to be an arduous process, very laborious, very difficult, very complex. But the Folger's official take, to repeat it, is they, meaning the actors, simply gathered and set the text as it was given. The Folger would have us believe that there was nothing much to it. Now, 8 names appear in the prefatory material to the Shakespeare First Folio. We've talked about 5 of them. We've talked about the actors, Heminges and Condell, who I believe are offered to you with the cover story. Ben Jonson is the impresario managing the whole thing. The Earl of Pembroke and his younger brother, the Earl of Montgomery, are the patrons who are footing the bill and making the publication politically feasible because they held important offices in King James' royal administration. So they held a great deal of political influence. Were other people involved in the process of getting the works of Shakespeare through the press? Might it have been helpful for Jonson to have input from his fellow literary associates? I believe he did. And I believe that what we're seeing here, which are three more dedicatory tributes, was signed by three men, were three men who were very instrumental in giving Ben Jonson a helping hand. They are Hugh Holland, Leonard Digges, and a little bit more mysterious I Am. And I point your attention again to Catherine Children's book, because she discusses this, and she also believes that they were important in the editorial process, these three men. Now, the three eulogists who contributed these verses, I'm saying unequivocally, were Jonson's, what we would think were his associate editors. But these three tributes that are published in the First Folio are just not particularly inspiring. Now, those of you who hear this may disagree with me, but I find them mundane, commonplace, vacuous, and generally innocuous and unobtrusive. They're just not very good. And I believe that the reason they're there in this innocuous and unobtrusive way is to give credit where credit is due to men who spent some portion of their lives and effort to bring the works of Shakespeare to the press. But it is innocuous and unobtrusive. That's why they're not very good. So as not to upstage the boss, Ben Jonson, and his very memorable tribute, which again, I want to point out, to call your attention again to Alexander Waugh's splendid presentation posted on YouTube. And you'll have a very great treat, wonderful treat in store for you by the readers, when this poem is presented by the readers on this YouTube presentation. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the second folio of Shakespeare, published 9 years later in 1632. Did extensive editorial work go into the second folio's printing? Now, this is interesting. The answer to that question is yes. Published in 1937 is a book written by two authors whose names are there. And in this book, they identify just under 1,700 changes from the first folio that were made in the second folio. These 1,700 or so just about deliberate editorial changes. They were deliberate, they were thought through, and they were not just mere corrections in typographical areas. They didn't, errors. They didn't just catch mistakes. There are 459 alterations of grammar, changes, many, as you can see the numbers, changes affecting the thought, changes affecting the meter, changes affecting the style, and 130 changes pertaining to the action. Who are the editors who made these deliberate editorial changes? One database says that these editors who made these changes were quite competent in their classical and mythological knowledge. I believe that these competent editors, I suggest this, were the same editors who worked on the first folio. They were the same guys. That's what I think. So who are these guys? Hugh Holland. Hugh Holland was a long-standing friend from Jonson's school days. They had attended the Westminster School where William Camden, very well-known historian, William Camden was headmaster. Camden had high praise from both his students, Jonson and Holland. And Hugh Holland was a member of Jonson's Mermaid Tavern, where actually he served as Ben Jonson's wingman, taking care of one issue we know about that was recorded, where Jonson could have gotten into some trouble, and Hugh Holland smoothed things over for him. Leonard Digges. Now, it's often talked about how Leonard Digges knew the publisher of the first folio, Edward Blount, which he did. But the Digges family itself was well established with the English intelligentsia. Grandfather Leonard, who had the same name, he's named for his grandfather, Leonard Digges, was the leading astronomer, mathematician, and friend of Dr. John Dee. Funny how John Dee's name pops up around once in a while in this thing. Dr. John Dee raised and educated Leonard's father. When he died, who was also, Thomas was a writer of mathematics and astronomer, and when Thomas died, or when father died, he had Dr. John Dee raise his son, and then when he grew up, Thomas Digges was a close associate and supporter of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, which is why, of his two sons, his older son, the older brother of our Leonard in the First Folio, his older brother was Sir Dudley Digges, and he is named for Robert Dudley. And as we know, Sir Dudley Digges became a very important political figure in the Jacobean and later Carolinian court. He was a writer, ambassador, and a member of Parliament. Leonard Digges, I want to give this information because those of you who've been around this for a while will probably know this. But if you're new to it, you may not be aware of these family connections. The Earl of Leicester's sister, Robert Dudley's sister, was Mary Dudley. She married Henry Sidney and became the mother of the supposedly fabulous Sir Philip Sidney. She's from the same family. Her daughter, Mary Sidney, Sir Philip Sidney's sister, married William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. So, our two incomparable brethren of the First Folio are Mary Sidney Herbert's sons. The Digges family, the whole family was well entrenched with the upper echelon of first Elizabethan and then Jacobean society. Leonard Digges, this is my opinion, and I offer this for your consideration, that the scholarly younger brother of Sir Dudley Digges is the representative of the Dudley-Sidney-Herbert family triumvirate. Now, at this point, I would be discussing who the mysterious J.M. is, and it could either be, it's generally accepted now that it is a writer, a translator named James Mabie. I'm putting on the table that it may be a writer named John Marston, and I'm going to skip 8 slides. We're going to fast forward because for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to write this up. Yes, go on and skip 8 slides. Thank you. Thank you, Costa. My final conclusion is I see no reason why I couldn't be both John Marston and James Mabie. But that is just my opinion, and I'll be writing it up and submitting it to Heidi for her consideration for the newsletter. Now we're going to talk about the writers of the tributes. Where might, if we had 4 men for sure, and maybe 5, where might they be hanging out? Where could they reside to do the serious intellectual work of preparing the Shakespeare plays for the press? What they would need would be an adequate venue. For an adequate venue would be a place large enough to house 4 or 5 men, provide them with lodging and working space. They would need private and secure surroundings for their work, with support personnel to provide them with food and beverage. We understand that Ben Jonson was very keen on food and beverage, and maintain them in a comfortable living environment. Could such a facility even exist? Now, I'm going to pause for just a minute to let you think about this, and I'm going to have a little sip of water. And the thought may be formulating, where on earth did Bonner get this idea? This is Gresham College. The diagram up at the right-hand corner tells you where different places were in it. It's a tremendous facility. It had been the home, Gresham College had been the mansion home of obviously a mansion, of Sir Thomas Gresham. He was the enormously successful financier, he's called. We'd call him a chief financial officer for Queen Elizabeth, and he founded the Royal Exchange. When he died in 1579, he left his great home to the City of London and the Mercers Company, of which he had been a member. In his will, he gave detailed instructions for the property to be turned into a college after the decease of his wife. His vision was that Gresham College would not function as a regular college. It would not enroll students, and it would not award degrees. What his vision was is that his home would become a center for free lectures on important academic subjects. The lectures themselves would be given on specific days and open to the public. Gresham specified the 7 subjects that 7 learned men would expound upon. Each lecturer was paid an annual salary of £50, which himself was a nice substantial amount of money to be paid. And each had his own apartments at the college, the home that was now a college, and they lived there year round. presumably preparing for their lecture at their appointed time to give it. The funds to maintain the building and pay the professors came from rents from the shops located in the Royal Exchange, which Gresham himself had founded. It's mind-boggling how carefully he had thought through his plans for this college. And it's even more amazing that the plans were executed to perfection, that he set out in his will in 1579. Next. Now, in these three biographies that I've already mentioned, a lot of my information comes from, there is a remarkable record which is just remarkable serendipity, and it comes from the Court of Chancery. This record was discovered in 1951 by Professor C.J. Sisson, a distinguished Stratfordian professor. Now, in their biographies of Jonson, these three historians know about Sisson's discovery, and that's why they write about it. But I don't believe that any of these three ever actually saw this document, which I am going to show to you now. This is it. This is a deposition given by Ben Jonson. Next. It is signed by Ben Jonson in the lower right corner. Now, it took some effort for me to get this document. I knew about the Sisson article from the books, but I couldn't find it. So I contacted a good friend of mine, Marty Hyatt, who agreed to look for it. And he's very good at finding things on the internet, but he couldn't himself, and so he had to go to two university research libraries to actually download this very document that you see on the left side, which is Ben Jonson of Gresham College by C.J. Sisson, published in the Times Literary Supplement in 1951. Once Marty got this document to me, in it is the PRO number for the entry for the court case. And then I contacted my researcher in England, who at the time couldn't do it because she was out of the country. So she gave me the number of another researcher who set up to go to Kew to the National Archives and who photographed this document for me at the National Archives. So it's very difficult to read because it's in secretary hand. So I will show you. So this is what it says. I've worked at trying to transcribe it, but I'm going to follow what Sisson had to say about it because obviously he did transcribe it. And you can tell that he's following. This is what it says. On October 20th, 1623, Ben Jonson was examined as a witness in a lawsuit in the Court of Chancery. The lawsuit was brought by Elizabeth, Lady Raleigh, widow of Sir Walter Raleigh. The suit was about a disputed settlement of Sir Walter's estate following his attainder and execution 5 years earlier in 1618. Jonson was called to testify as a friend of the Raleigh family and to testify to the authenticity of Sir Walter's letters, of his handwriting in his letters. Jonson begins the deposition identifying himself as Benjamin Jonson of Gresham College in London, gent, age 50 years and upwards. And I'm giving you a close-up. That what you see on the upper example is from it's the top of the deposition, and you can see the two X's, that's 20. And you can see that the secretary hand is very difficult to read, but I think the long word is October. 1623 is very clear. Look below that. You see Benjamin Jonson of Gresham. I believe Benjamin Jonson himself wrote those four words up at the top to identify himself, as well as signing it at the bottom lower right. And then if you go back to the words at the top, Benjamin Jonson of Gresham, at the word college, that's when the clerk took over and you get to that awkward secretary hand again. Benjamin Jonson of Gresham College in London. So two things stand out. I don't believe I need to point out the importance of this date, October 20th, 1623, when the First Folio was being expedited through the press. The of Gresham College is very telling because this is a deposition is sworn testimony. And I don't think Ben Jonson would not have I believe he was telling the truth under oath, that he himself had been there long enough to be associated with Sir Thomas Gresham's institution. David Riggs suggests that Jonson may have resided at Gresham College after his return from Scotland in 1619, and I would say that is very likely. I would agree with that. But Jonson's biographers can't figure out what in the world Jonson was doing in residence at Gresham College. It's all the more puzzling because the records of the professors of Gresham College have been meticulously kept through the centuries. This book is available on the internet. It's The Lives of the Professors of Gresham College. This was published in 1740. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. And I scanned through it, and I don't see a word about Ben Jonson. And neither does Johnson's very, very fine biographer, Ian Donaldson, who says in his book that there is not a trace of mention of Ben Jonson in the Gresham College records. The lack of notice is all the more surprising because in 1623, Jonson was at the top of his career. Whoever the King's poet and his team were, and whatever they were doing there at Gresham College, I believe, I submit to you, was kept very quiet. So Jonson and his team, I believe, I offer to your consideration, were in apartments, their own apartments. There were plenty of apartments left. And along with the apartments housing the 7 lecturers, they had meeting space to work with. Gresham had appointed specific areas to be meeting spots. It also had an extensive library at the college, and they had a staff to provide for them. So this is a scenario that they were working, doing the hard intellectual work of bringing the Shakespeare works, getting them prepared for the press. And this was a sub rosa enterprise. That's why there's no record of it there, other than there. It was conducted at Gresham College, where the expenses of the editors could be paid for. Their living expenses, room and board, could be paid for out of the funds that Sir Thomas Gresham provided for the college. Or you can believe that the Folger, as the Folger Library would have us believe, they, being the actors, simply gathered and set the text as it was given. I rest my case. I want to say just a few words, and I know that there will be a lot of questions because some of this is new material that is really, I've located it myself. I've been so pleased to find this. And if you will send an email to info, to the sofinfo.org, whoever gets it will forward it to me, and I will answer every email as best I can. Thank you so much.
Honor, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And what's amazing is there's so much information there, and we're following on with you. And I'm fascinated. Gosh, that was wonderful. Thank you.
I was stunned to find so much new information. I had no idea that the second folio had so many extremely hard, not just simple changes with typos, but they had so many deeply intellectual changes where people really needed to know what they were doing. And I didn't say this, I'm going to write it up, but the 2 actors were passed away by the time the second folio came about. So clearly, I think the men who were working with Ben Jonson on the first folio continued to work on it. And then that's why they got the second folio done in 9 years to make those corrections that they weren't able to get to in the first folio, or if they had thought about, and for some reason the presses were running, and I think you're looking at the same crew. But they decided at that time not to be public with it because the political climate was deteriorating badly. England was heading towards civil war. And even though it was another decade before it broke out, there was a lot of political angst out there for the royal administration and for the aristocracy. There was a lot of antagonism toward all this things. They decided, we'll just do our job and put some other tributes there and not have attention called to us again, because they were still living. That's my thought. Of course, you never know for sure unless you find a letter or someone saying this, but I think that's a really reasonable scenario. But I didn't know about that. And I didn't know at all about Gresham College. All this stuff I learned. And
I've learned an awful lot today. This has been amazing. This is like, I've had front row seats, Bonner. I've had front row seats. It's amazing.
And the key is the deposition that Ben Jonson is saying under oath that's where he's located.
So did you know to look for this document, or is that something you just discovered? How did that work?
I ran across the Sisson document. It was mentioned in Ian Donaldson's book. I had read carefully David Riggs' book and didn't catch it. It's so obliquely there. They don't dwell on it. They just put it there, and I didn't notice it. In Ian Donaldson's book I saw the date, October 20th, 1623. I said, hey, I know what he's doing at Gresham College. They're working on the first folio, And I just wrote that as a note a few years ago. And then I went back to it. And then I thought, well, does David Riggs do this? And I had read his book carefully. It's not even in the index in David Riggs' book. I mean, you have to really be alert, but it's there. So I went through it very, very carefully, and sure enough, it's there. Then I went to Rosalind Mill's book, which I hadn't read carefully, but she has the most stuff about Sisson's article there. And they all cite Sisson's article. So then I realized, well, I got to get to that article, and I needed Marty Hyatt to do that for me because I couldn't have extracted it on my own. He, as I said, he went to 2 research libraries. The first one was there, but he couldn't get it downloaded. So, I mean, he really worked at it. He deserves the shout out that he gets. I don't know if you've had the privilege of meeting. Marty lives in
I've never met, no, not at all.
He lives in Pennsylvania. He's been around and about authorship for a long time. He's a wonderful gentleman. And he was a very good friend of a mutual friend of my mother's. She was the librarian at the Huntington Library. She was the director of reader services. And Marty stayed really close to Ginger Renner and Mom and Dad. I inherited all these lovely friendships that came to me really via my mother and dad and their friendships. Yeah. That Marty was one of those. But he went to great lengths to find it for me. And then I got the check off a few days ago to the researcher who was referred to me by the original researcher I've been having, but she was out of the country. So, and I sent him a check a few days ago. This is very new to be learning.
Nice, isn't it?
And then when I saw it with my own 2 eyes and I looked up there, that's Ben Jonson's signature. And I compared it. It's later with Ben Jonson's handwriting in W.W. Gregg's book of early English autographs. That's clearly Ben Jonson's writing. He started to write Ben Jonson of Gresham. And then the clerk took over because it was the clerk's job to be copying out the testimony. But clearly he said, you can't get more clear than that. Which is an incredible, it's more than just a little helpful hint.
Yeah.
It's very, very meaningful.
Oh boy, this is wonderful.
And the biographers are kind of determined. We've seen this before. Great historians they are, and very brilliant people, but they're just determined not to pick up on the things they should be being carefully examining. They're just determined to ignore it.